All right. Hello. Welcome to the Pandemic Baseball Book Club podcast. This is Eric Nusbaum, author of Stealing Home, with Robert Elias and Peter Dreier, authors of 2 books this year, including Major League Rebels, which I have right here. And that's the one we're going to talk about today, 2 companion books. And before we get on to anything else, I'm going to start with the fact that you've written 2 books with different publishers at the same time about intersecting topics. Peter, could you tell me about the genesis of Big League Rebels and Major League Rebels?
Yeah, well, Rob and I have known each other for many years. We both taught at Tufts University many years ago, and we're both big baseball fans, and we're both teach about progressive social movements in our profession. So this is a book that's been germinating for quite a while. And originally we wanted to write one book. We had a contract with the University of Nebraska Press to write it. But the more research we did, the more gold we uncovered, the more incredible stories we found about some remarkable and little known people. The sort of manuscript got out of hand. And so we wound up writing 2 books, both about the rebels, iconoclasts, mavericks, and radicals associated with baseball, and how baseball has been part of the great social upheavals and movements of the last 100 years or so, but on slightly different, on actually quite different topics. Baseball Rebels is about the battles over racism and sexism and homophobia in baseball. And as we'll talk about today, Major League Rebels is about the fight for workers' rights and players' rights and corporate oligarchies in baseball, and about American imperialism and colonialism and the struggle, particularly of Latin American players, to address those issues.
So, Rob, could you elaborate a little bit on your relationship as co-authors? You've been teaching, you've taught together, you've known each other for a long time, you're friends. How is it both for you to work together and to put together? I mean, these are hefty, substantive books. How much disagreement is there? How much struggle is it to decide whose wording wins out?
Well, we had some challenges along the way, but I think the important thing is that we had strengths in some of these areas, and I think it divided up pretty nicely between the 2 of us. Things that each of us was maybe a little bit more interested in each of the themes that we looked at. And so it divided up pretty, as I say, pretty evenly. And we had, because we had to deal with what to do with such a long manuscript, we went back and forth about different options there. But I think that given the huge nature of the project, it went actually as smoothly as you might, as you could have expected.
That's great. The book reads really smoothly. You wouldn't necessarily know that there was another one and that it was carved out of a giant manuscript. It feels of a piece, and
we left a lot on the cutting room floor too. So
well, I've been a newspaper reporter and a journalist for most of my life, as well as a academic, and Rob's written novels. And so I think we both very self-consciously tried to make sure that even though both books have a lot of footnotes, the books are written in English and not in academese, So it's for the general reader, not for the specialist.
We try to make it as conversational as possible.
And they move pretty nicely chronologically, and you can feel the sort of momentum and really feel the changes in baseball as they're occurring, and the struggles to those changes, and the kind of obstacles that are perpetually standing in the way of progress. I'm going to ask, these books, this one in particular, is populated with people, and I like that it was sort of broken down almost more by the iconoclasts themselves than by anything else. Chapters are broken into almost biographies, which is something I love. Are there any particular players that you wrote about in these books or in this book that stood out to you and that you found a personal connection with? Rob, why don't you start here?
Yeah, sure. Danny Gardella. Gardella was a ball player for the New York Giants during actually World War II. He was exempt from the military, and he had a pretty good year for the Giants in 1945. But the Giants gave him just a tiny raise, and he was dissatisfied with that. And of course, all the ball players were dissatisfied. The reserve clause was still in effect. The antitrust exemption was still in effect. And so it not only bound the players to their teams, but it suppressed their wages. And so along the way, as far back as the 1880s, ball players have been pushing back against that. And one of the options they had, although it came along only infrequently, is there another major league they could play for? And so, in the early days, when the Players League came along, then players jumped in 1890 to that league, but it didn't last. And then when the American League came along, the players jumped from the National League to the American League, then the two leagues got together and imposed the same restrictions. The Federal League was the next one, and that only lasted 2 years. So what players are looking for, aside from breaking the reserve clause and the antitrust exemption, is some alternative. And that came along with the Mexican League, which was run basically by a guy named Jorge Pascal. And he was an owner in that league. And he was trying to lure major league players. He had previously lured Negro League players, and the competition was pretty good, and he wanted to enhance that. And he was offering contracts without a reserve clause, and also for much more pay than the major leaguers were getting. So Gardella was the first to jump, and he went to play in Mexico for just a year, and then he decided to come back. Well, in the meantime, for all of the jumpers, and there were about 25 of them, Commissioner Chandler had imposed a blacklist and said, you guys, anyone who jumps, you can't come back and play in the major leagues for 5 years. Well, that's most people's career. And so it was designed as a deterrent and also punishment for those who actually jumped. So Gardella came back, and he didn't like that. He was banned, and so he sued. And his case went to court, and the case was, he initially lost, and it was appealed to a court of appeals, a federal court of appeals, and two of our most eminent jurists in American history, Jerome Frank and Leonard Hand, wrote decisions in that case that condemned Major League Baseball and all of its practices. And so they ordered a new trial, and Major League Baseball was concerned about this. It was a threat that Gardella might win, and it might go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court might overrule the antitrust exemption, which would completely undo the Major League Baseball economic model. So they settled with him out of court.
May I interrupt you for a second and ask you, for readers and listeners who might not know about the reserve clause and might not understand, as you lay it out really well in the book, and I imagine most baseball fans who pick this up are people who are already aware of the century-long struggle of players to find a little bit of dignity and rights. But for folks who don't know about the reserve clause and don't know about the origins of the antitrust exemption, could you explain that?
Yeah, sure. Sure, the reserve clause is the clause in every contract. So all of the owners agreed that they would impose the same contract on all of their players. And what it did is it bound the player to that team or to any team that the player was traded to or sold to. And in addition, because they couldn't sell their skills on the open market, it meant that the wages were suppressed. So it's this combination of being enslaved on the one hand and also having their wages suppressed on the other hand. And this was allowed in part because baseball had received exemption from the antitrust laws, which would prevent, in theory, collusion of this sort. And this was handed down by the Supreme Court in 1922 in the so-called federal baseball case. Oliver Wendell Holmes was the author of that decision. And so the Major League Baseball, of course, wanted to maintain that exemption because it gave it all sorts of freedom to do these kinds of things. So the players then were trying to get around this in one way or another, if not through the courts, then through other means.
And so Danny Gardella was a kind of an early, not super early, but one of the earlier players to really take it into his own hands and put his career on the line by suing.
Yeah, so it's a kind of stepping stone. Some of those same arguments were used later in the 1970s, in the period that led to free agency. So he's kind of neglected, and that's what interested me in writing a biography about him.
What also interested me about Gardella was that he was a total character. He was,
Yeah.
he was a singer and an acrobat, and he was not your typical kind of boring ball player.
No, absolutely. And he played in Mexico, he played in Cuba, he played in Quebec. As you say, he had all sorts of other things that he did. He worked a lot of working class jobs. He was a hotel detective. He worked on Longshoremen's Union. He ran a restaurant. So he's a very colorful, interesting character.
You know, there's a thread that goes throughout the book about the reserve clause. And it starts with a guy named John Montgomery Ward back in the 1880s, who was the founder of the first baseball players union back in 1885. And then he was the guy that started what Rob referred to as the Players League, which was a player-owned league, which was a very radical idea at the time, but it was the kind of idea that radicals and labor activists throughout the country, not just in baseball, were talking about, including people like Eugene Debs. And so in 1887, John Montgomery Ward, who was also a lawyer as well as one of the great baseball players of the period, he wrote an article in a magazine, said, "Are baseball players the same as chattel?" And he referred to the reserve clause as baseball's version of the fugitive slave law. So he was making a direct connection between slavery and baseball. And these were craft workers, baseball players, who thought they were being, who thought they weren't getting the respect or the working conditions and pay that they deserved. And so 90 years later, when Curt Flood said that he was a well-paid slave, he was echoing the same sentiments of John Montgomery Ward about how baseball's oligarchy was basically imposing its will and treating its players like slaves. And as we know, Curt Flood refused to be traded, and he sacrificed his career, just like Danny Gardella did, for a principle of workers' rights and also civil rights in Curt Flood's case. And so there's been a thread throughout baseball of players feeling like they're being mistreated. And even today, when baseball players are making a lot of money compared to school teachers and factory workers, there's still that feeling among the players that they're being mistreated. That 24 out of the 30 Major League Baseball player owners are billionaires, and the ones that aren't billionaires are almost billionaires, and they're still acting like robber barons, like their counterparts did back in the 1890s.
So
they should be able to do whatever they want.
You hit upon something that interests me about this book that I hadn't really thought too much about, maybe to my shame, as somebody who studies baseball history for fun, essentially, and partly for my career. The connection between baseball players and their labor efforts and sort of the broader labor movement, which I feel like baseball fans and sports fans don't really think of the MLBPA or the fight for free agency, or even going back to John Montgomery Ward, which nobody really thinks about, unfortunately. And I learned a lot reading this book about 19th century baseball and kind of baseball player activism in that time. But those players were deeply aware of the labor movement around them, and they were plugged into it, and they worked in solidarity with other unions and with other thinkers. Do you think that that's been lost a little bit? Do you think that that sentiment was more prevalent, in the John Montgomery Ward era, or in the Danny Gardella era, or in the 60s and 70s as you start to see free agency coming into effect?
Well, whenever there's been an upsurge of activism in society, there's an upsurge of activism in baseball. It happened during the Gilded Era, which was the 1880s and 1890s, with the Players Union and the Players League. It happened during the 1930s with one of my favorite characters in baseball, Sam Nahum, who was a member of the Communist Party during the Depression, while he was pitching for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and fought against even segregation back then. It happened in the 60s, and it's happening now. It's happening now with the upsurge of union organizing at Starbucks and Amazon and all these other places. And you're now seeing an upsurge of activism among minor league players. And you're seeing an upsurge of interest in Black Lives Matter and related social justice issues among major league players. But I also think it's true that, as you were suggesting, that the baseball players union is not called a union, it's called an association. And for good reason, because a lot of the players, when they started the Players Association back in the 1950s, were reluctant to be part of a union. A lot of them were individualistic. A lot of them were from the South, small towns. They thought they were lucky to be playing baseball for money. And it took several of the stars, Bob Feller, Jim Bunning, Robin Roberts, Harvey Keene, and a few others around pensions, actually, to get players to organize. And then they hired Marvin Miller to be their executive director. And Miller was a militant labor activist. He came out of the Steelworkers Union. And he not only organized the players into an effective union, but he taught them about solidarity with other unions and the importance of labor history. And I think, to get back to what your question was, that's been lost to some extent among the players.
You mentioned the Dodgers and Red Sox crossing a picket line in the book during the 2018 World Series. And I remember that happening and thinking I was a little surprised by it. At the time.
This is 2 years ago during the World Series. I wrote a couple pieces about this in the Nation magazine. The playoffs and the World Series were in Boston, and the hotel workers from Unite Here were on strike. And the players were scheduled the teams had arranged for the players to stay in these union hotels that were on strike. And the players crossed the picket line. And even the players union reps for each of the teams crossed the picket line. I think if Marvin Miller had been around now and was still around, he'd have changed that, right? I don't think he would have put up with that. Right, as well as some other things that are happening in baseball now. I think the Players Union has a responsibility to help the minor league players organize into a union. They've become much more outspoken in the last couple of years. A couple of players sued Major League Baseball for labor violations, including minor league players make less than the minimum wage, many of them. Partly because of a law that Donald Trump signed, exempting Major League Baseball from the federal minimum wage laws. So they sued and they settled about 3 weeks ago in May for better wages and better housing conditions. It's still pretty miserable, but it's better than it would be. And Major League Baseball is a quarter owner of a sweatshop in Costa Rica, where all the Major League Baseballs are manufactured in a little town in Costa Rica. They co-own it with Rawlings. And I think it's the responsibility of the Players Association to speak out about that, to send some players down to Costa Rica as a delegation to meet with the factory workers and to basically say it's unacceptable that the ball that we play with in every Major League game is made by workers that make miserable wages and get serious injuries on the job because of the nature of sewing a baseball. They get carpal tunnel physical injuries. So I think the upsurge of union activism in America right now is a good thing. I think it's inspiring the minor leaguers, and I hope it will inspire the major league players to take an interest in the people that make their uniforms and make their caps and make their baseballs.
It's interesting with the baseballs too, because that's such a controversial point right now in the games, the actual baseball, and it keeps changing. And there's, I mean, there's almost more frustration from players about what the baseball feels like. Is it tacky? Is it light? Is it hard? Is it wound tight? Than where it comes from, but they're deeply connected.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, yeah, when Major League Baseball changed the rules about the nature of the baseball, there are about 700 workers in this factory in Costa Rica. They had to change the way they sewed the baseballs.
Yeah.
And there wasn't one article in any newspaper in America about what it was like for the workers down in Costa Rica to have to deal with this. It was all about, whether this was going to generate more or less or fewer home runs and make it easier for pitchers. But, the people that actually produce the baseballs, they're kind of invisible. And I think the Players Association should do something about that.
And that speaks to, I think, a broader invisibility of labor in Latin America and baseball, right? I mean, we have a system that essentially culls the Dominican Republic and Venezuela and Mexico and kind of just pans for gold essentially and disregards everything else. Do you think that there's been any movement to improve the situation for Latin American players? Do you think that that's on the horizon? Do you think that's something that the Players Union should be looking at or is looking at?
Yeah, I think so. There have been some slight improvements. Certainly the publicity has been so negative that it's forced Major League Baseball to at least show up down there. There are some more agents who are available, and they're trying to improve some of the working conditions. But it's still pretty much what has previously been called a boatload mentality. You sign large numbers of young kids, take them out of school typically, and with the hope that if you sign 100, then maybe one will maybe make it to the major leagues, and it builds up false hopes, and it sort of derails them from other things they might be doing, given the very low percentage of cases where they would actually make it. So I think this is definitely another area where the Major League Players Association should be exerting their influence and trying to change that system.
It also makes it harder for those players to speak out, right? And even as minor leaguers, for them to express themselves, because their situation is so much more tenuous than maybe a
very precarious
leaguer.
Very precarious, yes.
And during the lockout, a lot of the media coverage was kind of a pox on both their houses attitude, which was, here are the players and their union. Most of the players are millionaires, and they're battling these owners who are billionaires. But it is true that the owners are billionaires, and it is true that some players are millionaires, the guys at the very top. But what was not reported very thoroughly during the lockout or ever is that most of the players in the major leagues don't have long careers. The typical player plays for about 4 years. 25% of them in the majors only last 1 year. The major league minimum wage is $570,000, but most of them don't make that because they go up and down between the minor leagues and the major leagues during the season. And the minor league salaries are a pittance. And so not even the minimum wage is what they get. So if they're only in the majors for a couple of years, and a lot of them aren't educated. A lot of them, the ones that went to college, most of them dropped out of college. Most of the ones from Latin America didn't go to college at all. And as Rob just said, they were even recruited out of high school. So they never even graduated from high school. They're not millionaires. And a lot of them, when their careers are over, they don't have a nest egg to rely on. My friend Kelly Candell and I wrote a piece in The Nation during the lockout where we interviewed some former players who played the majors for a couple of years. They had the proverbial cup of coffee. We interviewed a guy who's a manager of a couple of Starbucks stores, and he's a part-time high school baseball coach on the side. Another guy we interviewed was in the majors for 4 years. He's now a firefighter in Phoenix. We interviewed another former player who's now a coach at a small Bible college in Georgia, where he probably makes maybe $45,000 a year. So that part of the story, and particularly what happens to the players from Latin America, is rarely told in the media. It's always about the players with the $30 million a year contracts.
Do you think that, let me try to rephrase this question. Actually, I'm going to go back. I'm going to ask a different question. You mentioned earlier Jim Bunning, and when I read this book, I couldn't believe that Jim Bunning was one of the leaders of the Players Union and early Major League Rebels that you spoke of, knowing what became of Jim Bunning's career as a conservative senator in Kentucky. How did that happen? What is there a sort of bipartisan history to the Players Union that maybe, I mean, you could say that, I guess that happens in many unions, but what's Jim Bunning's story, and how did he end up being Jim Bunning after being Jim Bunning?
Well, in the 1950s, Jim Bunning was one of the few major league players who'd gone to college, and he majored in economics at Xavier University. And he understood that baseball was now in the television age, and that these teams were about to make a fortune on television contracts. And he thought the players weren't getting a fair share. And so, he was looking out for himself and his fellow players around pensions and wages, and medical conditions and training and all kinds of stuff like that. And he was the one that recruited, he and Robin Roberts recruited Marvin Miller, because the union had existed before that, but it didn't have any full-time staff. It didn't even have a way to contact players during the off season. So he was a pretty good organizer. And he actually, when he played for the Detroit Tigers, the local press, which, Detroit's a union town, attacked him for, being, as did most of the press. They were against the Players Union. So he was never a radical. He was never, a guy who believed in, socialism or anything. He wanted Major League Baseball to prosper, but he wanted the leagues to share that prosperity with the players, who at the time were making, the minimum wage in baseball at the time was about $5,000, which is about $40,000 in today's dollars. So, these were, mostly working class guys, a lot from small towns. And it was some of the better players that organized the union and brought on Marvin Miller. And then, he, just like Jack Kemp in the NFL, he used his celebrity to get elected to office. First, he was on the city council in a small town in Kentucky. Then he was in the state legislature. Then he got elected to the House and the Senate. And he never pretended to be pro-labor. In fact, he was an enemy of the labor movement while he was in Congress. And he never thought that there was a contradiction between being a leader of the Players Association and being a right-wing reactionary senator.
So there are other anomalies like this, even if you go back to the early days. Some of the people who jumped to the Radical Players League included Connie Mack and Clark Griffith and Charles Comiskey, and all of them went on to be very conservative owners. And so they were on the other side of the ledger, and you'd think, well, how did that happen? And I just think it's the context of the times that make a difference. They were in one position at a certain point, and then they were in another position to be something else at another point. And maybe that helps to explain Bunning as well.
That makes sense to me. So one thing that we haven't spoken about yet is American empire and baseball's role in America's self-image as an empire and America's sort of colonial history in regards to baseball. This is a huge topic, but it goes back to the beginnings of the sport. Rob, do you want to talk us through a little bit about how baseball is wrapped up in American foreign policy over the last 120-ish years?
Sure, I'll try to make it succinct. I wrote a book a few years ago called The Empire Strikes Out, and it's a history of baseball's relationship to US foreign and military policy. And, baseball, of course, has been the prominent sport for most of our history. It goes back, to the early days of our history. And it allied very early with U.S. foreign policy and U.S. military policy. In a sense, it was a reciprocal agreement. The U.S. military, for example, got certain things from baseball, and baseball got certain things from the military. And this started in the U.S. And then as the U.S. projected itself all over the world, baseball followed. And so it was a way of promoting the sport as well as providing things that the military needed along the way. So you can trace this back to the Spanish-American War, and then World War I, World War II, and then on up to the present. So the concern here is that baseball has historically been too close, and in a sense a kind of adjunct to U.S. foreign and military policy. In a way that doesn't make it independent. It makes it a kind of an extension then of those policies. And so it's had some adverse effects, I think, along the way, and only a few ball players, occasionally an owner, would push back against this kind of thing. One of the more recent ones is Carlos Delgado. And Delgado was very concerned about the wars on terror, and particularly the war on Iraq. He thought it was a stupid, illegal war, and he thought that baseball was being exploited to take advantage of that by all the things that baseball was doing to try to, in a sense, promote the war. Putting American flags on the bases, holding these recruitment drives at the ballpark, waving the flag in various ways. And in particular, he was concerned about the imposition of God Bless America, the singing of God Bless America at the seventh inning stretch. And he refused to do it. He was playing for the Toronto Blue Jays at the time. And by the way, the Canadian teams were required to do this too, not just the American teams, which is kind of interesting. And he got actually some support from his Canadian teammates and even the Canadian owner. But he was widely condemned as a traitor by a lot of other people. And when he went from ballpark to ballpark in the U.S., he received death threats and just regular, sort of booing every time he came to bat. So he kind of stuck his neck out. And I think the thing that we added here, because some people know that story, is that this was not the first time he protested. He had been very active prior to this in Puerto Rico, which is where he's from. And he had been opposing, for example, US Navy operations there. There's an island there called Vieques, and the US Navy was basically destroying this island, leaving a lot of environmental damage. And he was very active in pushing back against that. So he had some, sort of activist experience leading up to this. And so in a sense, it culminated with this protest against God Bless America. In a way, it's kind of a prelude to what Colin Kaepernick ended up doing, taking a knee, before the Star Spangled Banner in protest against police brutality and in favor of Black Lives Matter.
And it's not, a lot of readers might be surprised at the number of players who, particularly during the war in Vietnam era, who were against the war and expressed that quite eloquently. And in particular, people might not remember that one of the people that did that was Tom Seaver, who had been in the Marines and was an all-American boy, and who was thought of as, kind of a conservative guy. He had a very conservative style, but he had a social conscience. And he used to go visit Vietnam vets in the military hospitals. And he began to think of the war in Vietnam as a huge mistake. And so in 1969, he made a public statement that was in the New York Times saying, if the Mets can win the World Series, the U.S. can get out of Vietnam. And he was condemned for that by the owners, by the local police, And during the when he pitched against the Orioles in the World Series at Shea Stadium, the fans booed him. He was the most valuable player in the Cy Young Award winner, and they booed him, the best player on the Mets, because of what he'd said about the war in Vietnam. And so, and there were other people, Doc Ellis and obviously Jim Bouton, and other people like that were outspoken about the war in Vietnam. And, just like, as I said earlier, the upsurge of activism among athletes often corresponds to what's happening in society, like Billie Jean King and the women's movement and civil rights. One of the stories we tell in this book, which is very little known, is that after Martin Luther King was assassinated in April 1968, every other sport canceled its games, including horse racing, in honor of Dr. King during the days of his funeral. But Major League Baseball didn't. The commissioner, William Eckert, a former Army general, basically said it's up to each team to decide whether they want to play opening day or not. And so Roberto Clemente and Maury Wills and Don Clendenin on the Pirates refused to play. They called a meeting of the team, and their team unanimously agreed not to play on the day of Martin Luther King's funeral. And the word spread throughout Major League Baseball, and on every team, players said they weren't going to play, white and black players. And so even though the owners insisted that they play and said they were going to punish them and retaliate against them, their backs were against the wall. There's nothing they could do about it because the players insisted. And this was, in effect, a 2-day wildcat strike by every player in Major League Baseball. The way the media framed it was baseball was just making a decision to honor Dr. King, but it came from the players, not from the owners. And it was in the spirit of the civil rights movement and the labor movement that they were going to go on strike for racial justice in honor of Dr. King. And that incident is little known, and it's not recounted in most histories of baseball.
There are many incidents like that in this book. It's amazing. I learned a ton, and I highly recommend anybody who's listened to this podcast or who has not, pick it up. So what's the best place to pick up Major League Rebels?
Well, anybody can go to their local bookstore and either it's on the shelf or ask them to order it. That's pretty easy to do. There are a lot of independent bookstores that have their own websites. I'd prefer if people didn't buy it from Amazon, but it's up to each individual. Or they can go to the publisher. In the case of Major League Rebels, they go to the website of Roman and Littlefield and order it directly from them. And for Baseball Rebels, the publisher is the University of Nebraska Press. And you can just go University of Nebraska Press, Baseball Rebels, and they can order it directly from the publisher.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, Rob. I really appreciate your time. It's been a great conversation. And I hope everybody who listened goes and buys the books.
That's been a lot of fun. Thank you, Eric. And let me just say to everybody else out there that you should read Eric's book about the Dodgers and Chavez Ravine, Stealing Home. It's one of the best baseball books ever written.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
All right. Have a good day, guys.
Okay. So long.